I wanted, particularly this year, I think one of the best new generation voices on this question. But Lyndsay is not new at this. She's been working for a decade or more on this issue. But she's a very creative and energetic and passionate advocate for social justice and the environment. Has been working on climate change, environmental health, all associated with our dependence on fossil fuels. She began, she's a Southern girl at University of Tennessee as a researcher, where she produced multiple reports on the emerging faith-based environmental movement in Appalachia, and then felt called to move into advocacy, which she has done ever since. She joined the National Religious Partnership for the Environment, one of the first faith-based efforts to help coordinate an interfaith energy campaign for really in 21 states, I think. It was a very powerful, new, first-time initiative that I was associated with as well. In 2005, Lyndsay joined the Sierra Club, and she began a first ever their outreach program to help bridge the divide between mainstream environmental movement groups and the faith community. And while that's more normal now, she will agree with me, it was not normal back then. There was a great divide between the environmental movement, which was very secular, really pretty much skeptical of religion, but now there's been a great new partnership, and Lyndsay was one of the ones who helped make that happen. She's published a collection of essays and sermons I have here called Holy Ground, a Gathering of Voices on Caring for Creation. And she was a policy analyst, advocate for public health. A month ago, she joined the American Lung Association as their Director of Advocacy for the Healthy Air Campaign, and she'll talk to you about that. I'll talk next week more about this interfaith delegation that we took to the Gulf Coast in the BP crisis, and Lyndsay was the coordinator of all that. I knew her before that, but she coordinated all this interfaith flotilla of all these leaders out on the waters of the oil spill. And I'm sure she'll talk something about that too. I've known Lyndsay for a while. She's been a friend of Sojourners and a partner on these issues for us. But I learned, you have lunch with somebody, learn something new. I learned, to my warming of my heart, that she's also was a serious baseball player as a kid for a long time. I love it when girls play baseball. And we had a girl in our World Series team this year at Connecticut, the only girl out of 12 teams. And she was a catcher, toughest, dirtiest job. And Lyndsay, I learned, was a catcher for a long time. So catchers are really tough people. And when a girl's a catcher on a boys' baseball team, you know she's really tough. So I should have suspected that. But she's one of the best voices I know that we have in this movement, and I'm really grateful that she took time to come and share with us today. So give a warm welcome to Lyndsay Moseley.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be here. That's quite an introduction. Didn't realize I would tell you all about my days catching, and I won't go into detail, but it was a lot of fun. I did eventually switch to the girls' team when it became available. So Jim asked me to come and talk to you all today about the climate and energy challenges that face our nation and our world. Namely, I'm going to focus on our reliance on fossil fuels and all of the cost associated with that, including climate change, particularly as we seek to meet growing energy demand with decreasing resources. So I don't know where you come from when it comes to environmental issues. Some of you might not think about it a whole lot. Some of you might be passionate activists engaged in campus work or other organizational work. But I want to assure you that wherever you are on that spectrum, I can relate to you, in part because I grew up, as Jim said, in East Tennessee, daughter to a very Republican family, and that does not, these days it might mean more than it used to in terms of your views on environment. But in my family, environment was not an issue. Concern for stewardship, these values that I have since learned were not something that, other than my grandmother, who loved to recycle and is talked about it more in conservation, sort of old school conservation of resources, not something that I thought a lot about. And yet, I've spent the last 10 years working to educate, motivate, empower, and inspire people to protect the environment. So at some point along the way, clearly, I had a conversion of my own. And I want to share not the whole story, but a couple of factors, because I think they're important. We bring our whole selves, if we're lucky, we're able to bring our whole selves to the work that we do, and this is how I got there. It was a slow and gradual process, but the very first encounter for me, I was an academic researcher. I accepted an assignment to research faith-based environmental activism. I was more generally interested in how faith shapes public life and public policy, but I wasn't really interested in environmental issues at the time. But I had this great privilege of interviewing faith leaders from all around the region in Appalachia and lay leaders who were working to advance the idea that caring for the environment was a moral and spiritual challenge. In fact, the moral and spiritual challenge of our day, according to many of them. That it was about justice and stewardship, concern for future generations, and this interesting idea of the integrity of creation. So I'm a researcher, I'm asking, what are the theological principles? What are the philosophical motivations? What are the strategies and obstacles to change? What are they accomplishing? How do they measure that? And in the meantime, I am listening and learning and having my own eyes opened. And then the second sort of, I guess, factor that really played was just some life experiences that I moved into from that place of openness. I volunteered to help a community near where I was going to graduate school deal with the fact that they were illegally dumped on with toxic waste that went straight into their drinking water system, and they were not on the public water line. I was in Europe on vacation in August 2003 when the heat wave killed 20,000 people in France the week I was there. I could not read French very well, but well enough to know that there was really something bad going on. And it really highlighted to me the vulnerability of the elderly and people in this case, elderly and folks who were ill, who were particularly vulnerable. And then I traveled to the Ecuadorian Amazon. It was a learning expedition to learn about oil and gas exploration. I had the privilege, it's one of the highlights of my life, I had the privilege of meeting a Siona shaman who was our host for the whole time that I was there. Deep into the rainforest, he took us into his community, which he rarely does. He sometimes guides other groups. And he shared with us this amazing, I really have little words for it, pristine, it seemed, beautiful rainforest. And then he was a man with a lot of joy. I have to say, he had this big smile, and it helped that he was wearing very colorful clothes. But you could just see his spirit, you could see his energy, whatever you want to call it. It was positive and joyful. But now he spends less time protecting the secrets of the rainforest and more time protecting his people there, who are being exploited in many ways by the oil and gas industry. One example, they're paid, there's an oil spill, crude oil dumps out from the pipeline onto the dirt. They're paid to clean it up, about $10 a day, and when I was there, they were given a pair of gloves to protect themselves from the toxics in crude oil. It's pretty bad. So somewhere along the way, I was transformed from objective researcher to advocate for a cause that I was believing more and more in. And I began to really understand what the burdens of some of our energy choices, how they can be disproportionately placed on the people who are least prepared to defend themselves. And now when I think of climate and energy challenges, I think of people. Some of them have names and faces. I think of threatened places that I've traveled and my own backyard. And I think of the creatures that inhabit all of these places. And I realize our system is broken. It's a fact that we rely heavily on fossil fuels for our energy needs, especially electricity and transportation. Coal, oil, natural gas currently make up 85% of our energy source here in the United States. Some of the costs of these fuels are obvious. You could probably name them: cost of labor to mine for coal or drill for oil, the cost of materials to build energy generating plants, power plants, or transportation of coal and oil to the plants. These costs are included in our electricity bills. We pay for them when we purchase energy. But some of the energy costs are not included in our consumer utility bills, nor are they paid for by companies that produce or sell the energy. So I want to take a few minutes to focus on what those costs are, the fact that they are externalized onto communities, with the primary point being that at every stage in the life cycle of these fuels, of our energy production, consumption cycle, there are costs that are externalized, and they are egregious, and they are borne by communities and ecosystems that don't often have the resources to defend themselves. So let's just look quickly at extraction. I'm going to talk about coal extraction and oil extraction, but just touch on a couple of issues, put some images in your mind. How many of you have ever been to Appalachia or seen the Appalachian Mountains? You can tell I'm Southern, I say Appalachian. I said Appalachia. Good, a lot of you have been there. How many of you have ever seen a mountaintop removal coal mining site? Is there anybody in the room who's had that privilege? Well, it sort of looks like, it's really hard to describe. The mountain is gone, and in its place is a wasteland. The wildlife that you see in those rich, some of the most oldest biodiverse mountains of the world are gone. Water is polluted. The communities are stressed and alienated from sometimes one another. There's an advocate named Larry Gibson who lives in West Virginia and has been defending his 5-generation little plot of land, and they literally, the coal companies have literally, it was at one point, you know, like 260 degrees around his property. I haven't been back, but I have heard that it is 360 degrees around his property because he won't sell. But he has people who come in with guns, who put snakes in his home because they think he's making them look bad. He's a spokesperson against mountaintop removal coal mining. They blow the mountains up, they move everything that they blow up, and they clear the trees, blow it up, move it into the valleys. They've buried 1,200 miles of streams in the region, and 400 mountains are permanently wiped off the face of the planet. It turns neighbor against neighbor in that region. Same in Ecuador. Some of the folks who work on the pipeline, they don't want to hear about the fact that the oil sheen on the water where they're washing their clothes is dangerous and toxic. Think only of the impacts of the Gulf oil spill as one image, one very powerful image of what can go wrong and how little we have control over oil extraction. Oil spills are pretty common. They happen fairly often. I don't know if anybody else learned that in the aftermath of the Gulf oil spill, but it's remarkably common. Moving on to production and transportation. You got to take oil, you build pipelines. Pipelines, their infrastructure, they get old, they burst, there are accidents. The communities, like my friend in Ecuador, affected by those. Here in the United States, the same, not long after. I mean, we've got this, you guys are going to talk a lot more about the Keystone XL pipeline to ship tar sands from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. So I won't get into that, but I think there's a lot to talk about there. And then, you know, go back to Appalachia. They wash the coal before they ship it out. And so there's this toxic slurry. They wash it with chemicals and water, and there's this toxic slurry. They just put it in a dam in the mountains and leave it there and call it a day. Not kidding. Sometimes those dams break and wipe out entire communities in the valley below. So then my sort of personal and present passion pollution that comes from combustion of some of these fuels. I work on air pollution issues. Air pollution from coal-fired power plants still is responsible for premature deaths of 17,000 at least people every year. And this is just mercury and toxic air emissions coming from coal-fired power plants. That doesn't have to do with the conventional pollutants. Still, today, right now in the United States, mercury and toxic air emissions are not federally regulated by our government, despite the fact that it was a mandate by a very strong bipartisan Congress in the 1990s to make it be so. And not just, oh, regulate toxic air emissions, but the actual stipulation is that the Clean Air Act, they need to meet the standards set by the best performing 12% for those most hazardous air pollutants. Not yet. The current administration is set to actually finalize standards that would reduce mercury by 90% later this year. We'll see if it happens. There's a lot of pressure pushing them back. And then talk about carbon pollution, another byproduct of burning coal and other fossil fuels for electricity. I'm hoping most of you are very familiar with the arguments around global warming, with the science of it. Is there anybody who wants a Climate 101? I'll talk just briefly about it, about the impacts of the warming temperatures of the planet. And just this week, I don't know if you guys saw this in the news, one of the climate skeptics who said, I don't trust this temperature data, got funded in part by the Koch brothers, funded to help reevaluate a lot of data. His research is in the peer review process, but the preliminary findings are that he is saying, I was wrong, the temperatures are rising, and global warming is real. Just the latest in some of the science. But the impact of the warming temperatures is the shifting weather patterns, melting polar ice caps, leaving low-lying communities vulnerable to rising sea levels. The warming climate will exacerbate the spread of infectious diseases. I read the other day that even poison ivy is going to get bigger and uglier and more toxic. Not excited about that, but it's maybe the least of our concern. And increasing the likelihood of extreme weather events, more intense hurricanes, heat waves like what I experienced in August of 2003. Not saying that's global warming related, it's the type of thing that we will expect to see more of. And then just touching on waste generation. Two things. I know it's not technically in the same sense a fossil fuel, but nuclear energy, the waste issues in the broader conversation about climate, a lot of people gravitate toward nuclear because it doesn't have carbon emissions. But I don't think, I am an advocate, I bring an advocate's perspective to this. I don't think that anything where we can't actually protect, we don't have a way to store the waste, and we don't have a way to make it less toxic for a really long time. I don't think we have any business in increasing that. That is a personal opinion. But then going back to fossil fuels, 30 miles from my childhood home, 1 billion gallons of toxic coal ash waste, which is what's left over when you burn coal for electricity. The dam burst, and it went into a very quiet, lower middle class lakeside community in Tennessee. Beautiful, beautiful area, peninsula, utterly destroyed. It is still, it moved a house off its foundation. It happened at 1 in the morning. If it had happened at a time when people were playing in the yard, I'm sure that people would have been killed. 1 billion gallons of toxic sludge, a wall 6 stories. We're not handling our waste well either in this system of how we produce and use and dispose of our energy. So I think the system is broken, and I think that how we are relying on fossil fuels is wreaking havoc on the planet, whether or not you happen to have had a chance to review the science of climate and make up your mind on what you think of it. Whether or not our dependence on fossil fuels is wreaking havoc on the planet. In fact, Harvard Medical School analysts say that coal alone generates $523 billion in health costs. So we talk about costs that are externalized, where are they born, health costs being one of them, over $500 billion on an annual basis. Those are resources that could definitely be spent in a better way. And I have to say, maybe doctors and respiratory therapists and morticians would be out of a job. I don't think they'd mind. Some say fossil fuels are a necessary evil. I agree that they're evil, but I don't agree that they're necessary. The externalities, they've been allowed to exist in our system in some cases by design, and others by unintended consequences of policy incentives, and in all cases, by the absence of sufficient pressure to force polluters to pay the true cost of doing business. But it doesn't have to be this way. Clean energy alternatives are available, and there are entrepreneurs and researchers, engineers, academics, faith leaders, mothers, students, many global political leaders who are investing tremendous resources in developing that path forward and urging the adoption of cleaner and more just alternatives. They envision a world where we can leave the mountains intact by building windmills, where we can pass on pipelines from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico by investing in a combination of local or distributed solar, batteries and electric cars, batteries that actually can take energy off the grid during the day and store it overnight for fuel your cars. And where we don't actually have to fear the impacts of toxic waste, whether it's in our water, in our air, in our lungs, because there won't be any in their vision of a clean energy future. In fact, researchers Mark Jacobson of Stanford and Mark DeLucci of University of California, Davis have done some calculations, and they assert that it is not only possible to meet 100% of world energy demand using only energy from clean sources by 2050, but that doing so would not require the invention of hydrogen cars or some other technology that's now in nascent stages. They say that we could actually do it using off-the-shelf technology, and they calculate how many wind turbines we would need, how much land, what would be the land mass coverage for solar powers, both in concentrated solar and distributed solar. They calculate how many batteries would need, that kind of thing. And they admit that it would require a massive retooling of our manufacturing sector, of auto industry, and a ramp up along the lines and maybe much bigger than what we saw around World War II in the ramp up of building airplanes and other weapons. But in a recession, that doesn't actually sound like that bad of an idea to me. The kind of jobs that can be created, etc. And in some countries, we've made some progress here, but in some countries, they're making great strides. There are more than 100 countries around the world who have actually adopted policies at their national level to spur renewable energy. Germany, for example, is expected to generate nearly 40% of its electricity from renewable energy by 2020. That's not too far from now. It's like 9 years. And in 2009, for the second year in a row, here in the United States, there's some good news here. US and Europe actually added more new electric power from renewables than from conventional sources like coal. But in order to really take it to the next level, to have a prayer at meeting some of the goals that are laid out in the climate debate of reducing emissions, 80% by 2050, we really have to step it up in this country and abroad. We need a federal clean energy program to take it to the next level. So what would it look like? What would a federal clean energy program look like? Renewable energy targets, energy efficiency measures, bringing an end to the $10 billion subsidies for dirty fuels. These are a few of the top priorities. But these policies are up against relentless opposition from who? From those who benefit from the status quo. These are the people who have externalized enormous costs onto communities, who have enjoyed policy loopholes, for example, with the Clean Air Act, for more than 20 years, been able to avoid the cost of pollution control technology. Coal plants that were built 40, 50, 60 years ago, that's capital investment that has long since been paid for. So their revenue stream is pretty free and open. So how are they spending their resources? They're spending their resources defending their way of life, the status quo. So we've touched, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but we've touched on the importance of shifting the economics, of asking polluters to pay the full cost of doing business, instead of offloading sickness and destruction onto communities. We've touched on the importance of shifting government subsidies away from fossil fuels. Let's put our money where our mouths are. Invest in clean energy if we think that's what we need to do. As a nation, seems to me the debate is still open and not necessarily fair. But it's not just government policy that's going to save the day. There are a lot of things that businesses can do, schools can do, churches, we can do in our own homes. There's a school in Tennessee actually that saved, in a year from one simple action, $40,000, not a ton of money, but when it comes to buying new school equipment, that actually can be really helpful by doing one thing, by turning off their computers every night. It's a pretty simple thing. They're also saving tremendous amounts of energy. And in Tennessee, in the eastern part of the state, most of that energy is coming from coal companies that rely on mountaintop removal coal mining technology. So you can see that these decisions are all connected. And I think it's important to recognize that those individual decisions that we make, people think, I can't do anything, it's not going to make a difference maybe. If I flip that light switch, what difference does it make? But if you believe that it makes a difference when you flip it on and that you're creating demand for coal-fired power plants from companies that rely on this incredibly destructive and unjust mining practice. By the way, I say unjust. Profits have gone up significantly with this new mining practice. Mining employment has plummeted over the last 15 years since they've really ramped up the use of it. So this is not a practice that's benefiting coal miners in Appalachia. They want to tell that story, but it just simply isn't true if you look at the numbers. But what I wanted to say is that it makes a difference. Flipping the switch on makes a difference because you're creating the demand for mountaintop removal coal mining, for example. In my opinion, flipping it off also makes a difference, and I want you all to see the little things. We live our lives in inches and minutes, little by little, and they add up. We got ourselves into this problem in a cumulative, slow way, and it's a lot of work to get us out. So what's holding us back from a clean energy revolution? According to Jacobson and DeLucci, it's not technological, it's not even economic, but it's social and political will that's lacking. As they point out, and as we've been discussing, current energy markets and institutions and policies are really set up to support the production and use of fossil fuels. We're stuck in an old system. This is not a system we can tweak around the edges and get out of these sticky situations. And let me tell you, those who benefit directly from this system are fighting harder than ever to keep it this way. Big oil last year, oil industry, spent $1 billion over the last 10 years to lobby against clean energy policies and pollution control laws. That's a lot of money that could be going to other uses. The coal industry in recent years has spent also millions of dollars in advertising. Who has seen a commercial touting clean coal technology? Almost everybody. And those who haven't, do you watch TV? They are out there everywhere. Who's heard the president say clean coal in any of his speeches? This is one sign of power and where it rests. From my perspective, there's no such thing as clean coal. And if you look at the life cycle of coal, it's hard to dispute that. What they're talking about is capturing carbon emissions, maybe putting them underground or putting them in a big tower. It's sort of a fanciful idea that is not included in the Jacobson and DeLucci vision for a clean energy future. But anyway, so moving on, their efforts are really having an impact. They make campaign donations. They are shaping the political will of this country in powerful ways. And they are silencing the voices of people all around the country who have a very different vision of what our future should look like and what the timeline is we should be moving toward that new clean energy future. A couple of impacts, and then we'll move into more of the conversation about the faith community. Evidence that the industries that are lobbying for the status quo are having an impact. So we had a big climate debate. Did anyone follow that? Do we have anybody who's like really interested in climate policy? It's okay if you're not, no judgment here. But the House leadership after the 2008 election worked really hard to pass a climate bill, really hard to find something that was a viable legislative proposal that could pass, and they worked really hard to set it up, to tee it up for the Senate. And the Senate, not only did they fail to pass legislation, which they seem to be doing a lot lately, to limit carbon pollution from major sources, but they also almost passed legislation that would roll back the only existing tool that we have to clean up carbon pollution, which is the Clean Air Act. It's not the best tool, it certainly isn't economy-wide, and it is not the most efficient tool, but it's the only one, and it came under attack. When I think about this system we're in, I get this image of sort of me and other people like me, or you and anyone who cares about the future of our energy economy, sort of playing tug of war with an elephant, or maybe a giant team of elephants. It takes a lot of people pulling in the same direction at one time to move it an inch. In Thailand, they actually say that it takes 70 men to move one elephant. No, to take one elephant and come to a draw. But the image is clear. We are pulling against some pretty entrenched, some pretty heavy, some pretty powerful interests that are vested in staying right where they are. So how does the faith community fit into all of this? Where does spirituality play a role? What is the faith community doing? Is this about science and policy and politics? Or is there something deeper at work? And are there opportunities coming out of a deeper place in the human condition to make changes? Does this transformation require us as human beings, maybe as Jim has suggested, that we need a conversion of sorts to break free, to make a clean break from the ties that bind us to our previous historical reliance on fossil fuels and allow us to embrace this new vision? And I would say yes. Over the past 30 years or so, but really in the past 10 years, it's become clear that this really isn't just about science and politics and policy. It's a debate over values. It's a debate over much more fundamental questions, not how many wind turbines can you fit on a mountain, but who is my neighbor? What is my obligation to my neighbor? And this is where the engagement of people of faith and of all faiths, there's a growing interest and momentum toward engaging environmental issues as values, from a values perspective, a principled theological perspective. And to me, that's a ray of hope in all of this, a very bright ray of hope. So a clean energy conversion, that I'm talking about, sort of that full-scale transformation that we talked about, the vision of Jacobson and DeLucci, even if they acknowledge that the political will isn't here today. What is it going to take? It's going to take a lot more than the right amount of steel and the right amount of labor and pull it all together. It's going to take nothing less than the heart and the mind and the soul and the strength of everyone who sees that vision working towards it. Faith community leaders included, and they are playing a key role in mobilizing this transformation. So what does that role look like? You know, rarely in our history can any other institution provide the kind of values-based community support needed to facilitate a personal or collective transformation. And I think people approach this from a variety of ways, but I'm just going to outline maybe four. I'm going to approach it with this perspective. Faith community is playing a really critical role in facilitating that conversion, and there are maybe 3 or 4 stages in that conversion process, and I want to talk about ways the faith community is engaging. So in the sort of first stage I will talk about is, I've called it, and I know that others have taken different approaches. This is just something that I think is makes sense to me based on my experience. But so first, reflection. inviting others to see environmental degradation and injustice, to make connections between what's happening before our eyes and ancient principles and deeply held values. There are a lot of people, perhaps like me, who don't come to this because we kind of get it from the outset. You know, I grew up in a fairly religious family, and faith is important to me, and looking at environmental stewardship through the lens of a faith perspective invited me into the conversation in a way that I just simply would never have joined otherwise. So how is that happening? This is where the theologians are really important, prominent faith leaders like Mr. Wallis here, who has been doing this for a very long time. The uphill battle, the tug of war with an elephant ideas. You must be tired, Jim. But, you know, for example, Jim and others in the evangelical community talk about this as creation care. This is a reflective mode. It is language that reframes this, that says this is sacred, it is holy, it deserves our protection. Patriarch Bartholomew, he's known as the Green Patriarch, was one of the early environmental leaders to use the word sin in association with environmental degradation, and that really highlighted this perspective. I mean, it was so new, and it was just like, whoa, he just called that a sin. And it was like these, you know, sort of stereotypes of religious people and stereotypes of environmentalists as just, you know, never the twain shall meet, coming together and breaking people's, you know, blowing their minds. A very recent example, I got a magazine from the Evangelical Environmental Network today. They've been working on some of the air pollution issues. They're approaching, so mercury is a neurotoxin. It is particularly dangerous when women who are pregnant eat fish for the developing fetus. So they are approaching clean air as a pro-life issue. So reframing this is inviting all kinds of new people into a conversation that they have perhaps previously shunned. It's a pretty powerful, I mean, there are evangelical leaders who are at the Right to Life March, who are at the National Prayer Breakfast every year, and who are at the Evangelical Environmental Network's effort to host a prayer breakfast specifically on mercury pollution in the unborn. So reflection, that theological education, the sort of making connections with those ancient principles and values. I may come back to talking a little bit more about what sins might be underneath this, but I want to make sure to honor our time together. So I'm going to possibly come back to that if maybe in conversation we can talk a little bit more about that. I bet you have some ideas about what might fit under that category. But then, so you've got the reflection piece, and that really is, that's worship, that's theological expose kind of thing. It's reframing, it's language. And then sort of more into the science. There's an educational piece here that isn't just head knowledge, but it's also inviting the rest of your soul into this, your heart, your mind, your strength, your spirit, the part of you that feels. So we've got some pretty ugly things happening in the world, and some of them deserve to make us angry. Some of them warrant feelings of guilt. Some of them warrant feelings of shame. And nobody, not even me or anyone I know, really wants to feel any of those things. And if we can push it off to the side and deny it and intellectualize things, we don't want to feel them, right? We don't want to feel. Faith communities, spiritual communities, can provide a space in which it is okay both to feel the suffering of the planet, of the people, of the communities, to let us be in touch with that, because that is what will help drive a personal conversion. Is you don't just get converted by thinking thoughts. It's a heart thing, it's a feeling thing, it's a spirit thing. Faith communities can provide the language to help invite you into that, the space to help transform individuals who may otherwise not be in the conversation, to help us be in touch with the reality, the suffering that is currently happening in our world that we're not always in touch with, but you can't stop there. You can't stop with anger. You can't stop with guilt. You can't stop with shame. You can't stop with those things, because that's not what this is about. This is about action and moving forward. And so faith communities, also through worship, also through education, through the creative process that is, it doesn't have to be this way. This is an injustice. I'm going to name it, and I'm going to mourn it, and I am going to create a vision for how to move into the future. Visions are compelling. Science is convicting. You need both. And faith communities can help bring those together in the process that will help drive conversion and hope. A values-based alternative vision can provide hope in the midst of despair. When you're looking at something as dire as some predictions are related to climate change, your option is despair or hope and action. And faith communities can help agitate in that way. The response to this, they can also help facilitate and call you, individuals, into action, to repentance, to renewal, to the behavior change, both in sort of how I live my individual day-to-day life, in how a congregation or a gather at mosque or temple, church, synagogue, come together and live collectively as a microcosm for and a vision for alternatives to the world. And there are a lot of communities that are doing this, have been doing this intentionally for years, but lifting them up. And I think that's one of the things that Sojourners has done so incredibly well, has been a communication, a mouthpiece, a call to action, and a place where this can be articulated at, far beyond a local congregational level. I mean, thank you, Jim, for providing that and being that call to action for so many people. And call me idealistic, but I think that faith communities, and perhaps in partnership with a higher power, can really lead individuals and communities forward and nations through these stages of conversion for seeing things with new eyes and engaging heart and mind and strength in the process and helping to create a vision and agitate for change, for repentance, for renewal. And I think when you get to that point and you're aware of where we've been, my hope is, and I see this at some level, that there's also an impetus to correct what has been wronged, to do the restoration piece. That's why I said maybe 3, maybe 4 pieces of conversion, because once you're converted, my hope is that it follows into working to restore what has been broken, to change the system, to agitate for policies, to reform your own energy life. I gave up my car. I used public transit. It's one small thing that I chose to do. I live in a city that enables me to do that, so I benefit from that system. But those kinds of decisions as well. And I think it is important here because there are competing visions of justice. There are competing visions. What about the coal miners for deep mining who might be out of a job if the price of coal increases so much that everybody switches to a cheaper, cleaner fuel? So what does the transition look like? What does justice look like? This is another piece in correcting some of the wrongs that have been done that the faith community is paying attention to and has a special ability to help navigate that. I mean, who better to navigate difficult conversations about justice and competing visions of justice than faith leaders who approach it with compassion, who welcome both sides, who attempt to welcome both sides. I mean, I think people are people and they have strong opinions, and that's important. And I want to show you a video, because this is all somewhat abstract, this idea of reflection, of naming things, using new language, inviting people in, lifting up the voices, sort of the education piece, the call to action piece, the restoration piece. But I have this clip from a trip that we took down to the Gulf that Jim mentioned, where we took a group of faith leaders to learn about what happened. Who was impacted? We tried to put them, it was on fairly short notice, but we did a couple of things. We did a worship service that we organized. We had about 150 people come again with very short notice, an interfaith, I guess I should say, an interfaith evening of prayer. It wasn't a worship service, it was an interfaith evening of prayer that invited communities to come and mourn the loss. We took, as Jim said, a flotilla of faith leaders. We had 5 boats that went out into the wetlands. The water was pretty high, so we didn't see it as in as devastating condition as others had when the water was lower, but it was still pretty profound experience. But I want you to notice some of those things in the very short, it's a CNN clip, we had media crews, because part of this was to shape the national debate. The faith community, doesn't engage in science and policy conversations exclusively, but in a conversation about the moral and spiritual components, elements of these crises. And so this was an effort to say, hey world, this is a moral and spiritual issue. This is not just about failed technology in the Gulf. So that's what this is, and did I just click here?
Yeah, the mouse should.
All right. Oh, there's a mouse?
To the right side of the keyboard.
Oh, I'm thinking I've got a touch screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think a lot of people is not praying like they should pray.
Born on the bayou, this Louisianan falls upon her faith to survive this massive spill.
God is really testing us to see how strong, if we really gonna get to God, or let, it destroy us.
Vanessa Bartholomew is one of many in these oil-soaked communities who this group wants to talk to. They're religious leaders of multiple denominations who've come from across the country to witness the damage firsthand. The trip, sponsored by the Sierra Club.
No, this isn't God's plan. It's human folly, human sinfulness, human greed, and it's wrong.
Jim Wallis, CEO of Sojourners in Washington, isn't playing politics here. He says this is a moral issue. Wallis is praying for an epiphany, starting with our nation weaning itself off of oil.
Epiphany is a religious term for waking up. Something hits us and we feel something we've never seen before, and it's all new now. It's like conversion. If this doesn't lead to a conversion or an epiphany, then all the suffering and the pain that we're seeing will be in vain.
The pain is evident within these tight Gulf communities. Tom Costanza says he sees it every day as he works with the Archdiocese of New Orleans.
There's depression, there's substance abuse. These are issues, family issues. We have to be very aware of the family unit and keep it together.
Costanza's concern is for the fishermen's families, if they're lucky, feeding their children like these men by doing cleanup. But their boss is BP. That is, if they're working at all. But at the same time, this man of faith insists Louisianans are resilient.
They're pulling together. It is hard on them. And
I mean, Katrina was just 5 years ago. Aren't people saying, why again?
It's the strength and the testament of these people. They're going to come back. There's no doubt about that.
And according to this rabbi, they're going to come back with the spiritual strength of the entire nation.
Ultimately, the issue rests not with the people of the Gulf alone. It rests not with BP alone. It rests not with our government and administration alone. It rests with people of conscience saying, we are busy, we lead lives of great stress, but I will give my attention here.
Attention this woman would welcome, despite doubts from those who don't believe.
Do you understand why some people say this is a man-made disaster and God has nothing to do with this?
Right.
God can't fix it, man needs to fix it. What do you say to those people?
But God gives the man wisdom to do what they have to do.
Brooke Baldwin, CNN, Barataria Bay, Louisiana.
So I have exceeded my time, and I'm going to draw it to a close there with just a couple of words of encouragement for you. I look out and I see a group of young adults that's incredibly, you're here, you're at Georgetown, you were admitted, and you're in this class with Jim Wallis. So I'm going to conclude some things. I'm going to make some assumptions. I'm going to assume that you're a pretty intelligent group. I'm going to assume that, in fact, you're gifted because you're here. And I'm going to assume that you are privileged. If by virtue of nothing else than the fact that you're here and you're in this room today, even if you walk away with student loans. I am also going to assume, if you let me, that you're here because you're curious, probably because you are compassionate, and you're interested in this connection between spirituality, public life, and you're in school. So you haven't made up your mind up yet what you're doing. You're not really far down your career path. And I'm not standing here to call you to ministry per se in any spiritual tradition, but I am going to encourage you to take your full selves into whatever career path you choose. Don't check your values at the door, because what you do, whether you're in science, whether you're in economics, whether you're in technology, whether you go into medicine, you go into advocacy, whatever you do, it doesn't have a neutral impact. And what you can do can increase joy in the world, and it can increase suffering in the world. So I want to encourage you to think about your lives through that lens, to move toward work that increases joy in the world more than suffering, given that both are part of where we are and the realities of life in this world. So thank you all very much.
Okay, we'll share this mic and the other one we'll pass around. Thank you, Lyndsay, very much. These, I'm going to tell you, are controversial issues in our politics and our public debate. We'll talk next week more about the tar sands pipeline issue, a good case study of this where one side says we can't afford not to embrace the jobs and the energy security that the tar sands pipeline Keystone would provide, and yet the leading climate scientist says if we do this, it's game over for climate change. How do you negotiate? How does the Obama administration is trying to decide whether to approve this, and this is the debate that's raging on the inside of the White House right now. So you don't need to agree with all of this or any of this, but I think number one, you can argue the science and the economics of what Lyndsay talked about today. But then you need to answer the question she's pressed in other ways. How do you deal with the extraction issues, the production issues, the pollution issues? What is your answer to them if it's a different kind of answer? You can challenge the religious faith arguments as well, but then you got to explain in other ways theological notions and imperatives like stewardship, social justice, creation care. How do we account for those in different kinds of ways? And I think we've got to also, you've heard me say time and time again, everything in this course needs to pass a street test, not just stay up in the air in our heads, but practically. I mean, the reason when I talk about the transition to a clean energy economy as a conversion, I don't mean that in some kind of ethereal, esoteric way, but the change required on every level, institutionally, culturally, personal lifestyle, is of such a magnitude that conversion is a word that actually applies. The change would have to be so big from one kind of economy to a different kind of economy. So what we can't do, the one thing we can't do is participate in denial. That none of these problems exist, because they do. We've got to solve them one way or another with one kind of energy and economy answer or another. So with those ground rules, let me just open it right up to you all about questions, comments to what Lyndsay said to us this afternoon. Yes, sir. Colton. Oh, okay, Rob first, then Colton. Go ahead, Rob, you get the mic.
I guess my major question would be, why is this sort of the area that we should be focusing our efforts on with such sort of limited resources? I guess if we're talking about sort of a World War II level ramp up of industrial production across multiple years, I can imagine, honestly, we're talking about thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars per person that we're investing in our economy. And I would guess that if you talk to the majority of Americans and said, we would like to spend, $10,000 to make your life better, clean air would probably not be, the first and foremost concern that comes to mind. It seems like there are a lot of other, poverty sort of reduction programs and things like that a lot of people would place on a higher priority. So I guess, given limited time and resources, why should we focus our attention here?
It's a great question. And I think, continuing with the theme of understanding and talking about what role the faith community has played in this, the answer to that could be, you could do a cost-benefit analysis and look at, for example, you could compare the $523 billion in health costs that are currently being borne by people here in the United States with, the $10 billion in subsidies to the oil company and the additional subsidies and tax loopholes and incentives that result in net economic benefit for the coal industry. I don't have numbers off the top of my head. So you could do a cost-benefit analysis comparing the benefits to the cost, and in the case of air pollution, studies have shown repeatedly the costs far are dwarfed by the benefits. So you could take a rational approach, or you could look at it from a normative perspective, which is a question of moral and spiritual, or let's just leave spiritual out of it, but talk about it in moral terms. And you get into the conversation of what ought we to do, what is the right thing to do, what is the just thing to do, and that is that's what the debate is about, is how are we going to organize ourselves, what do we believe is right, and in some ways it's whose voice is loudest, who has the most money in terms of how it's currently being shaped. But I would answer your question of why should we invest resources in this particular way, because the alternative, to me, the consequences of catastrophic climate change, of the temperatures rising at the rates that they are currently rising, and the impacts that will have on destabilizing the climate, the mass migration and refugees that will be created by rising sea levels in poor countries like Bangladesh and some of the the island communities, where their entire island is 3 feet above seawater. So I think it's a question of justice, it's a question of fairness, but I also think when we look at the long-term cost-benefit analysis, I think you actually, and I don't have numbers off the top of my head to back that up, but I think we actually win in a rational cost-benefit analysis as well.
You also could take how they would answer that question, ask them, and right now it'd be something about jobs, I suspect. So you could look at this whole question in terms of what in fact could create most jobs. This morning, Morning Joe, again, I work out during Morning Joe, so I always watch Morning Joe. He was talking about the technology problem with the job question. How many bank tellers, he said, do you see anymore? There are so many things. We're losing jobs to technology that will never come back. They're not going to do things that put jobs back in by taking technology out. So where are the new possibilities for job creation, particularly jobs that can't be exported overseas? And some would argue, Van Jones, who was in the White House for a long time, if he would argue that the job creation potential of the energy economy shift is substantial for jobs, higher paying jobs, good quality jobs, and jobs that will stay here, can't be sent somewhere else. So public health jobs and the cost of doing things the way we do them now is something that is not often calculated or anyone pays for. So they're public expenses that we pay for one way or the other. So you could do that rationally, economically, and you can add the dimension of theological imperatives of good stewardship and the creation, all the rest. So there's different ways to argue that question. Colton, you want to jump in here?
you touched a little bit on what I was going to say, but my question, I guess, for you was this summer. I'm from Minnesota. I interned for a congressman, and something he was really pushing was, getting an approval process for mining taking place in northern Minnesota. And this was an example where there's a lot of these rural cities, communities that don't have a lot of jobs, and these companies want to come in and mine. And essentially there are sort of standards that are blocking that. And the argument was this would provide a lot of jobs for these communities that they desperately need, and that the sort of state environmental policies were good enough that it wasn't going to cause too many environmental problems. Obviously, some people disagreed with that. I guess my question for you is, do you think that government can come up with effective regulation and policies that makes, developing mining and fossil fuels okay, or are those things we should just not pursue at all?
That's also a really good question. And a delicate one to answer. So, in part because of the highly politicized and polarized debate around the issue of jobs. So, I will say this. I think it depends on the fuel. I do not think, in the instance of coal mining, that there. So I worked for Sierra Club for 6.5 years. The policy was, it's fine if it can be mined safely, burned cleanly, and doesn't exacerbate global warming. And if you put the fuel to that test, it fails. And there's very little that can be done in a comprehensive way with available technology today to help it meet that test. Coal plants are about to be, if EPA moves forward to implement the Clean Air Act, 21 years after the amendments were adopted to actually promulgate the rule. Then coal plants will put on technology that will reduce mercury and air toxics 90%. That is much better than no pollution control technology. The instances of illness, hospitalizations, lung disease, exacerbated asthma attack, heart attacks, all of those things that come currently from the unregulated emissions, they'll be cleaned up. Is that a good thing? Is that something I support? Yes. Does that help create jobs? Absolutely. Right here in the United States, you've got the operation, installation, and maintenance of pollution control technology. You've got the construction jobs associated with some of the coal plants would likely make an economic decision. Their operator would say, I'm either going to switch fuels or I'm going to shut down and invest in new technology, a new plant. So there are other jobs available as part of that. I am less comfortable commenting in detail on natural gas and oil, but I will say that I am skeptical, and I think the opportunities really don't lie in reinvigorating fuel sources of the past, but really in investing our resources and our energy and creating massive numbers of jobs, potentially, if it's done right, in a clean energy economy.
Eric?
I enjoyed your talk, and I should preface this by saying that I'm totally sympathetic to all the things that you're pointing out. One of the things I've always struggled, though, in the climate change debate is the way emissions are outsourced. And if I just pulled up this study, it says that the U.S. outsources about 11% of its emissions. Japan outsources nearly 18%, and European nations outsource anywhere from 20 to 50%. I think you can make a pretty compelling case that as more stringent carbon emission standards have been put in place in Europe, they've been outsourced in a lot of cases. And without a change in consumption patterns, it's really just sort of shifting where the manufacturing is actually taking place. At the same time, the implications of that are quite radical in terms of changes in consumption patterns. So I was sort of wondering your thoughts about that, and whether you think that these issues aren't accounted for in the public debate, and also maybe how to address this kind of global commons problem that seems very difficult if you can't get cooperation from the Chinese, from countries that are still mired in pretty extreme poverty. How can we move forward on these issues? And does it make any sense for the United States to take action if these emissions are just going to be outsourced?
Where do I start? Yeah, you, I think, have struck on something that is incredibly challenging. It played, actually, I think, quite a prominent role in the debate over climate that played out in the House and the Senate over the last couple of years. And at this point in time, the decision was not yet. We're not ready. The United States is not willing, the political will does not exist to step out as a leader, to step out as certainly not the first to try to work toward a comprehensive, meaning nationwide, which is where we have that jurisdiction approach to reducing carbon pollution. And the decision was in part, I mean, there was a lot of conversation about, well, they're just going to outsource jobs to China. They're just going to build coal plants in China. We're going to export our coal to China. There was a lot of talk about China and India in this. China's brought on more renewable energy. It's pretty amazing what they're doing. So I think that there are some misperceptions in in public dialogue about what's actually happening in China. They are building coal plants, and they will be a problem. But they are also investing massive resources into renewable energy. But yes, I mean, who's going to lead? Who's going to take the first step? And I think, again, there are arguments from a lot of different perspectives. One of the normative sort of moral components is that, the United States has contributed to, about a quarter of global emissions in the last 150 years, and we were about 5% of the population. So when you look at that, one could argue, and there are other perspectives, but you could argue that this nation has a unique responsibility to step out as a leader in the solution, as well as we have led in the pollution. So,
let's put it this way: most people, what are they looking for? They want to fuel their lives, right? They want electricity, air conditioning in Washington, August. They want to go places. They want to be transported. I don't think most people say, and I really want that to happen through coal plants or deep wells in Alaska and in the Gulf. They don't really care how it's done, or before they know how it's done. They just want those, and they want jobs. So we were talking over lunch. I asked Lyndsay what the best thinking in the environment was of, let's say the society committed to a clean energy economy transition at every level. Government did everything the environmentalists want them to do in terms of sticks and carrots, incentives, all the rest. So when could you have an economy that was fueled by only clean energy? How long would that take? There's going to be a gap, and in the gap, how do you fuel people's lives? And then there's debates about, is natural gas better than coal? Yeah, but it's not perfect. So T-Bone Pickens says natural gas, and some say nuclear, but the French are never right. So there's a whole gap issue. The other thing people want is jobs. I don't think people say, I really want to work on the tar sands pipeline. That's my vocational goal. I want a job. So if you could show there are jobs in the transition, as good or better jobs, that would be attractive. But there's this other level to the conversation that we need to put on the table, which is changing consumption patterns. And how much are we willing to embrace that? Here's a fact. If everybody had a Ferrari, it would kill the planet. I was in Abu Dhabi. That's why we're doing 2 classes today. I was in Abu Dhabi 2 weeks ago. And I went for dinner with the World Economic Forum participants to the Ferrari theme park. It's a Ferrari theme park. I've never seen so many Ferraris. And they have Ferrari rides. They have a roller coaster, fastest, biggest roller coaster in the world, inside the building of the Ferrari theme park. Now, if the goal is to all have Ferraris, I will tell you factually, it will kill the planet. So my hometown of Detroit decided, tragically for its own future, to go SUVs a few years ago. They could have gone for, let's lead the world in energy efficient vehicles and electric cars. Had they done that, my town wouldn't be a ghost town now. They didn't. They went for SUVs, and the advertising was like, you know, all sort of, like my two boys see a Hummer now, and they go, yuck, because their mindset, what a stupid, irresponsible thing. You ever seen a Hummer limo in DC? That's my ultimate, Hummer limos, you know. That is the ultimate sort of kind of irresponsible, the planet, my boys would tell you. But we didn't want kind of those energy efficient cars. We wanted the big muscle SUV stuff with NFL football players coming out of the door. You know, it's what you want and what you're, you know, it would be easier if everybody had a car. But, you know, Joy and I have made a decision to be a one-car family. With kids, it's hard to do no car at all, but one car. That means inconvenience. It means carpooling, calling Joey's dad, can you take Luke to the game if we bring him back? You know, if you all had cars, and then Luke, he's 13, 16, he can have a car too, and we all have cars. The problem is there are consequences for those choices, particularly as the population is growing. So, but that's where we don't want, particularly as Americans, to make different, or have to make different choices about transportation, consumption. If you turn down the air conditioning in August, you know, just turn it down, it's a little less comfortable than if you're kind of, you know, walking into a ice box after the sauna outside. So those are kind of moral, lifestyle, value choices, and then there's the macroeconomic choices. So what's clear, though, is our choices are being made for us right now by oil, gas, coal industries. Those folks are writing the legislation, blocking the regulations, and they are determining what your politicians think is possible for them to say and do. Do you want that or not? Is there a different alternative? And when will a citizen movement say, I don't want what's best for Exxon to decide my children's future? That's the issue. Daniel.
Is it okay if I ask a slightly unrelated question? I mean, it's not exactly related to what you just said.
Only related questions, Earl. No, of course.
Okay.
Please.
Oh, here we go. Okay. I was wondering, what do you think of the possibility that, like, what I heard is that the climate change might actually exacerbate conflict in the international community among countries and maybe even lead to war if there's a shortage of resources. Is that sort of an overestimation, or I was just wondering your thoughts on that? Is that a likely thing, or yeah?
That's a great question, and it's something that, you know, I'm not a national security expert, so take it with a grain of salt. But I can tell you that the Pentagon thinks it's a problem, and they have been actively engaged in the climate and energy debate from a national security perspective because of exactly what you're talking about. So in my opinion, if major generals are weighing in with members of Congress privately behind doors, if the Pentagon is educating its staff and employees about how to handle the potential consequences from a security perspective, then I'm going to say yes. People are taking it very seriously. There are actually a group of veterans that have taken this on, and it's sort of their, you know, who are returned from Iraq, who go around and educate people about the cost of our dependence on oil from a very, very different perspective, from a human life perspective, from their comrades in arms who have been killed while serving in the Middle East because they are convinced that it is very much natural resource related. And then they look forward and they read some of these reports from a national security perspective, and they are a different kind of activist in their own right because they don't want to see this perpetuated in the future or worsened.
Or Darfur, you've heard of Darfur. What's the issue there underneath it all? Water. Water. And Davos, which is not a left-wing forum, trust me, they have this whole risk assessment thing going on. And their big concern is global conflicts over food and water and drought and weather shifts, all of that. So, I mean, does anybody wonder why all of our last recent wars have been in the Middle East? Because we think they're only dictators in the Middle East? Only human rights violations there? Only pretext of wars? No, it's because, as Gary Hart, who's a national security Democrat, so we gave a talk at the Aspen Ideas Festival, he says, we only fight wars for oil. Finally, if no oil is involved, there's no wars in the Middle East. So why? So I think the conflict question is very real. But again, Rob's question, that's kind of abstract to a lot of folks who just say, I don't have a job, or I don't have a trajectory for a job. I'm not sure where my trajectory is even going. But for conflict, there's no doubt that climate change is an exacerbating factor, I think.
Well, I am committed to optimism, and I believe in the power of grassroots organizing, of people who are out in the world, they're reading the newspaper, they are listening to the debate and getting more and more outraged. Many of them are down in Freedom Plaza as a part of Occupy Wall Street because part of what is actually part of this problem is the stronghold that corporate America has on our politics and policies, not just oil and coal, but others. And so there is definitely a growing dissatisfaction with that. And so the question is there a galvanizing force? Do I believe that there is, or soon to be, a galvanizing force that will take that dissatisfaction, will take that energy and channel it in productive ways to bring about climate and energy policy? Is that sort of what you're asking? I'm going to say yes. The question is when. And my hope is that it doesn't take the kind of focusing event, a kind of a major disaster, that we don't wait until it is right before our eyes in ways that even, that no politician could stand up and deny. Because I think at that point it'll be too late. So I can say I do believe that it will happen. It's a matter of when and what are the consequences of the delay between now and then. So I will answer it generally, not try to sort of read the tea leaves and come up with a timeline, but I do believe in the power of grassroots organizing. I believe in the work that is happening, folks like Bill McKibben and the organizing he's done with 350.org, organizations like Sierra Club who are really working hard on the ground to educate and mobilize their members, to engage them in these debates and keep them informed in the work that faith communities are doing across the nation to reshape the dialogue, to take it away from that this is all about job killing and sort of to tear away the veil and raise the issues underneath as what they are. So I think it will happen. I am personally working to try to help from a policy perspective. I feel like I'm in the belly of the beast rather than out there really making the change happen. I am constrained, like our politicians are constrained by what's happening out in the world. So I sure hope so.
It's probably one word that I'd add just one word to that, which is proximity. The fracking issue is so extreme, and if you go and you have the powers that be create these sort of green, grassy slopes and trees for the public to see. Just walk into the trees, walk past them, and you see this moonscape. They're deliberately hiding from anybody to see. You see that moonscape, any American says, that's not worth it. If you see the moonscape they're creating, most Americans, Republicans, never say, that's not worth it. How much the country's going to be a moonscape? How much is allowable for that? Fracking does it. The problem is, like the Minnesota case, this is only going to be in northern Minnesota, where none of us live, or very few people live, or Alaska, where no one lives, and this polar bear stuff, I'm not into that, I mean, so if it's distant from me, it's harder to organize. But where communities have really been impacted by dirty air, people have died of cancer, and all the data shows it's their proximity to this coal plant. That's where you see the energy kind of rising up. But we're in a situation where people are really afraid and they're insecure. And I was down in the Gulf, and the fishermen who took us out in those boats, I'll say more about this next week, it said they weren't working. They weren't working because there was no, you couldn't fish, And yet, in the mayor's office, and he's a good mayor, I know this guy, he said, our whole economy here is based on oil. So this just happened, and yet they were against the moratorium on more drilling because they had no other economic alternatives. And yet they were the ones who were suffering from what's happening. But there was no, okay, we got wind power jobs for all you people. There was literally no alternative. So the mayor, whose sister's a senator, they were against the moratorium because they needed the jobs. Now, if you say, what do you think of BP? They would say, they use words like slave masters. We hate them. We don't trust them. We don't like them. And we're dependent on them. I heard the term slave master, but we need the jobs. They're saying we love what the oil economy does for our quality of life. No, it just ruined the waters that we love. But we need jobs, so we're against the moratorium. So the conservatives say, look, even the people there, they don't want any moratorium because they're stuck in working for people that they hate. That's really the language that I heard. So it's a really powerful kind of that's why the language for me of conversion really fits. This is a captivity. We are captive to the way this economy is organized. And we'll say more about that next week. It shapes our foreign policy. Our foreign policy is the way it is because of our addiction to oil.
And I want to say something, just follow up on that, about jobs. Because it's, especially in a tough economic time, like we're in right now, when a lot of people don't have jobs, simply threatening that a policy or decision or action on the part of any government entity is going to cost jobs is very much like a death knell for whatever that policy is, regardless of the truth of the statement. And so in this town in particular, have you ever heard the story of the boy who cried wolf? Well, industry keeps crying wolf. They keep saying, this is going to cost jobs. This is going to destroy jobs. In the 20-plus year history since the Clean Air Act amendments, they've been making these threats A lot of energy sectors that are much smaller and have less power to resist safeguards being required by the Environmental Protection Agency. They've cleaned up their pollution. They've been required by law to put in place mercury and air toxic safeguards to keep communities safe. There are 3 sources left that have not done that. They're the 3 largest sources: coal plants, cement plants, and industrial boilers like pulp and paper mills. They have the political clout. Now, pulp and paper mills are in a different situation. There are very real, that is an easy industry to send overseas. And so when those folks are talking about jobs, they have some real concerns that are pretty evident, and you can look at that and you can evaluate the truth of those claims. The coal industry has a history of playing dirty tricks like issuing pink slips to a bunch of employees when a mining permit is rejected, and then just rehiring them later, or issuing it before a decision is made. And despite, I mentioned earlier, I think it is I'm not going to cite the statistics, I can't remember them, but the relationship of profits to employment as it relates to mountaintop removal coal mining, profits have gone up, employment has gone down. But when they oppose Environmental Protection Agency guidance on what is and is not okay when it comes to mountaintop removal coal mining, that you have to protect streams, there's a stream buffer rule. You can't blow up the mountains if it's within a certain distance of a stream. And when they issue that guidance, they claim that this is going to affect all of these jobs. And so what I'm saying about jobs is, ask the tougher questions, don't take it at face value, look into it, and seek reason. We don't have a lot of people in our political sphere who are trying to reason through these. It's a lot of knee-jerk reactions on both sides, but I think you can actually get to some answers about the truth of the claims of a company that wants to do mining in northern Minnesota. Well, how many jobs is it really going to create? Don't just take the company at their face value. Or how many jobs are really going to be lost by this regulation? Don't necessarily take the Environmental Protection Agency at face value. Be a critical thinker in these things. I guess that's the message on jobs.
Well, what's happening now too often is, I think, there's the caricature is the environmentally concerned liberal elites. Those people all have jobs. They have jobs, well-paying jobs. And they don't care about the kind of workers who don't have jobs along the route of the Keystone Pipeline. And those Keystone Pipeline people there, they look at the people who have jobs and they don't have jobs. I think that the environmental movement needs to be probably more concerned, more empathetic with people who are losing their jobs. But then it's fair to have a hard-headed economic analysis of which kinds of energy future will create more jobs and better jobs. Let's have that argument. Which future will create more and better jobs? And let's have that conversation as a big factor here.